conversation to talk about what it is that you do. Also, I'm a teacher of rhetoric and writing. So the things that I'm talking about with you oftentimes become the content of the course. I teach cultural theory and theories of relationality and interdependency. These are things that I talk about in the content of the class that we're doing. So I know not everybody has that ability to align the content of the course with actual concepts and theories related to inclusivity. So I just wanted to acknowledge that as well. And then just an overview. So I want to give definitions of key terms and then some examples in my practice and then open it up for conversation. But one thing that I'm noticing is the pictures of everybody is blocking how I can see. Can I move the video? Everybody's faces sort of blocking my...
You can go up to the top,
yeah.
Julie, and just use speaker view if that helps any.
Okay.
I think we might have lost. Oh, there you go.
Okay, I think I did it. Okay. All right, so I'm going to start with definitions. So as a rhetorician, I believe definitions are arguments. They're assertions about the state of what something is. And so when I work with my graduate students, I'm always talking to them about, we need operational definitions of your key terms so we know where you're coming from. And so this is a definition of inclusivity that I've been working with, and it's from Rebecca Walton, Kristen Moore's, and Natasha Jones' book, Technical Communication After the Social Justice Turn. And they define it as efforts to forward a more expansive vision of an established institutional space, one that intentionally seeks marginal perspectives, privileges these perspectives, and promotes them through action. So that's a particular definition there of inclusivity that I'm going to be, that informs my thinking. And then this is how I interpret that definition. So understanding inclusivity as working to change a system for purposes of making it better, more equitable, and just. And so what inclusivity isn't then is adding a difference to some existing system. So for example, adding a book written by a Black woman to a required reading list that heretofore included only white male authors. And so we think of that as additive inclusion. And so the presence of difference doesn't mean inclusivity according to this definition. Okay, so then the question comes, well, if we're talking about changing a system, what does it mean to change a system? And there are lots of ways to change a system, but the one that I'm going to be talking about today is by changing interactions on a local level. So thinking about the classroom as a space where interactions are happening all the time, right? And so how do we as teachers shape what kinds of interactions happen in that space? And so I think that for an institutional system to change, we need different ways of interacting with one another in our day-to-day practices. And so this is what I mean by working to create an accessible institutional culture. And accessibility here, I'm using Robert McCruer's definition, and he argues that in an accessible society, according to the best critically disabled perspectives, is not simply one with ramps and braille signs on public buildings, but one in which our ways of relating to and depending on each other have been reconfigured. And I just really love that way of talking about accessibility. So, so we don't change what happens in the institution simply by making it possible for more people to enter the building. That's necessary but insufficient. So we also have to change our normative terms of relating in the space, how the interactions happen there. So putting it all together, this is how I bring all these pieces together. An inclusive space is one that is committed to changing normative terms of relating for purposes of forging systemic change. So this involves recognizing and valuing interdependence, not independence, challenging neoliberal values of autonomy, personal choice, and colorblindness, seeking and centering the perspectives of those most marginalized by the system, then listening to and learning from them, and then actively working to make change as a consequence of that learning. So some interdependent classroom interaction. So a couple of years ago, the Department of English was able to pay 3 students, Black women majoring in English education, as diversity consultants to talk with us about their suggestions about how we can create a more inclusive program. And some of their suggestions were as follows, and I think they're great examples of what I've been talking about. So they talked a lot about including students in the process of selecting texts and analytical frameworks for analyzing texts. And again, this is, in the context of English, right? And then related to that is, and this is something that I've done since talking with them, is developing supplemental evaluations delivered at multiple times throughout the semester that empower students to revise the course. So including them in the process of creating the course and then also empowering them to help revise it. And they said simply asking questions like, what isn't working for you and how can we fix it? It doesn't have to be some big, long, involved evaluation. But then importantly, then actually changing what you're doing, or at least report back as to why things haven't changed, right? And making more transparent your pedagogical intentions. And then the other one was asking ourselves, how can I, as a faculty member, use my platform to help get my students' voices heard? And so inviting students to present with you on panels at conferences, and then also really importantly, encouraging them to see the work that they produce in your class as being worthy of being shared with the larger university community. So writing things on projects like, this is a great project, has a lot of potential. Have you thought about, submitting this to the WGS symposium? And I'd be happy to help with you and put together the proposal and revise it for submission. And increasingly over the years, I've had students tell me that it was only because I wrote that at the bottom of their paper that they ever considered themselves as someone who could do something like that, right? And so, and I think it's more too than just saying, you might want to consider this, submitting this as a paper for a conference, but also then offering to mentor them on doing the proposal process, interpreting the call for papers, writing the proposal, and then preparing for the presentation. Okay, so inclusivity in your classroom. So some questions to think about, and which is, how are you defining inclusion, right? So I offered a definition that I've been working with, but how have you been thinking about it? And maybe looking at practices that you actually engage in the classroom as a way to sort of work from bottom up to understanding the definition that you're working with. And then how are you working to enact that definition at every level of scale? And I think this is really important because, well, I'll talk about in a second. So what I mean by every level of scale. So in the classroom, you have your course design, and then the texts, and then the major assignments and classroom activities. So it's at every level of what happens in the classroom, that same definition is consistently enacted in the practices. And so I think that's a way that you build trust. And I think inclusive spaces have to be spaces where people can trust one another. And the coherence in the syllabus design, in the texts, in the assignments, and in what students actually do in the classroom space, I think that works to build trust. And because it shows them it's more than just lip service, right? That like, this is actually something that I really value. And then the other thing is, depending on how you define it and what that translates to in terms of practices, actually devoting time and space in your class to those things. So an example that I oftentimes give of what not to do is when I first started teaching writing back when I was 24, the teaching practicum I had, everybody was talking about how important it was for students to do small group work. I'm like, yeah, okay, yeah, that's fine. Because I myself hated small group work because it made me confront the reality that I, in fact, didn't control, everything. And so I hated doing small group work. So when I had my students do small group work, it was like, okay, get in groups. Like I gave it no value because I didn't value it. And so the students pick up on that, in 2 seconds, right? And so their small group interactions weren't very productive. And so So now something that I do with students as a teacher of writing, something that's very important to me is peer review. So students reading and responding to each other's writing. And I devote significant time in the course to talking with them about their past experiences with peer review, and then showing them examples of peer reviews I've received as a writer, you know, the revise and resubmit letters, and examples from students who've written review letters in the past with their permission to share them, and then actual time in class for students to peer review each other's papers. And so the idea is, by devoting class time, I'm actually communicating to students that this is something that I value. Then the other thing, so we can talk about levels of scale in the classroom, from, you know, when you're first imagining what a class is all the way through what you're asking students to do in class on Wednesday. But the classroom as one scale, a part of a larger system. So the classroom as connected to the department, the college and university, the profession, and then the world outside the profession. So basically, you know, something that I ask myself, and I'm not claiming any moral high ground. I mean, these are things that I work with, you know, and through all the time, and you know, ask myself, am I doing this? But if I value inclusivity in the classroom space, how am I enacting that same value in, say, department meetings? How am I enacting that same value in professional practices like writing review letters for journal submissions and that sort of thing? So that's what I mean by levels of scale too, beyond just the classroom. So some examples from my class, and so this next one, and I haven't successfully moved the all of your nice faces, so I might not be able to actually read this, but this is kind of a long passage, but it's actually an excerpt from my syllabus. So this is actual language that students see. And this was what I gave them, was part of the statement for the class that I'm teaching this semester. So as a teacher,
Julie, if you can't see it all, I can read it for you. So whatever you can best do.
oh, I think I can. I think I know what it is that I can't see. So
Okay.
I'll try, but thank you. So as a teacher, I'm committed to doing the hard work of learning what I don't yet know. And this includes not only doing my own research, which inform my design and text selections of this course, but also listening to and learning from my students. As such, I strive to welcome with humility and non-defensiveness student suggestions for how our space can work better. Given that I'm a white person who was assigned scholarship written predominantly by BIPOC, I'm especially aware of my responsibility to do the hard work of teaching myself what I don't know, and listening to and learning from those who already know and do better, and then translating this learning into action. As a human being, I'm committed to becoming a better one, more patient, loving, joyous, fierce, just, aware. I'm also imperfect. If I ever do say or write something that hurts or offends you, I would welcome the opportunity to apologize, make amends, and do better. I also understand that calling someone out or in is a relational investment, and that not all relationships are worth the work. I aim to demonstrate in both word and deed that our working relationship is deserving of such frank talk. So that's that, to me, I think changes normative terms of relating between teacher and student, and making it transparent to my students that I'm committed to changing what we're doing in the classroom and how I'm doing it in response to their experience of what's happening in the class. But again, I just want to reiterate that, you know, my subject position and my positionality in relation to the institution makes this something that I can do that maybe other faculty wouldn't feel comfortable doing. Another example is, this is an example of an assignment that I gave in a cultural theory class that was specifically focused on theories of relationality and interdependency. So it was called Interdependency Recognition. So to be submitted with your course project, this assignment asks you to recognize the interdependencies that made your project possible, as well as those that your project, I can't read that part.
Help sustain.
Help sustain, thank you. Specifically, you will identify the nested set of reciprocal relations and obligations that enable you to complete your project. Who took care of you so that you could do this work? You can, of course, think here in terms of personal relationships, but I also invite you to think of intellectual work as a kind of care. On whose scholarship does yours depend and how? Think here not only in terms of the scholarship you reference and build upon, but also the scholarship you exclude. For such exclusions function as boundaries that carve out intellectual spaces in which your work can occur. What organizations and institutions care for the scholarship on which yours depends? How does your project care for others? What kinds of ethical relations does it help sustain? And what kinds of unethical relations does it intervene? And then just by way of closing here, then thinking about departmental interactions. So there's what's happening in the classroom and then thinking about this in relationship to the department. So for example, am I paying attention to and caring about how my actions might add to the racial trauma of colleagues who are BIPOC? So for example, not asking a colleague who is BIPOC to process with me an experience I had where a student's racist response caused me to doubt my ability and expertise. And so basically what I'm arguing here is the culture of the department exists in relation to the culture of the classrooms, and inclusivity or its absence in one system affects the possibility for inclusivity in others. And that's it. That was my formal part. And now I'll just, let's see, stop share. And then if we want to open it up to conversation, I don't know, I have no chat literacies, or at least they're developing. they're in construction. And so if somebody can help me.
Julie, I can read things out as they
Okay, if
appear
there's
in
questions
chat.
and stuff like
And
that.
there has been one comment in chat, and that's from Dr. Houston. Your statement, this is about, she wrote this when you had the syllabi statement up there.
Oh.
Your statement is very powerful, in caps, very powerful, sincere, and intentional. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. So one of the things that I also wanted to mention, and I forgot to mention, is that you know, all of this is, I'm talking about the face-to-face physical space of the classroom. This remote experience, the Zooming experience, for me has been a challenge, because what I've realized is that so much of my sense of what needs to be adjusted in the classroom space is a function of this embodied sense that I have. So like I can feel over there that there's something happening with a student, right? And so then I turn and I can say, you know, ask a question, or just I hear a heavy sigh, you know, and so not having access to that embodied knowledge, and as a teacher being able to revise what I'm doing in response to that, has been a real challenge for me in this this age of Zoom. So one thing that I was interested in talking about was, you know, what challenges, or maybe ways of addressing those challenges, have people been able to develop, or seem to be working in their class in terms of creating inclusive spaces?
I think that's an excellent question, Julie, because we all know, we're from ISU, and we know what a important emphasis we put on teaching, and we know that teaching is relational. And Julie, you're talking about how that's compromised with Zoom. So what do you all say?
I would say that I haven't taught in a couple of years, but when I was teaching some our diversity courses or our social justice courses, and initially it takes some steering, if you will, or helping students to be able to engage with each other. I think there's sometimes a fear that students feel that they'll be judged, and so breaking down those barriers more so that the students might have with each other. Some of them, of course, have natural relationships with peers, but having those conversations where they feel like they can just be themselves, break down those barriers, and not feel judged. I say that is, you know, there's quite a bit of work in building that, and it's not going to happen on day one or day two in the classroom.
Doris,
Yeah.
when you say that, I'm thinking you were we were maybe a little bit in sync with what you were thinking about. And I'm thinking, Julie, how you position yourself, even from the very beginning in your statement in the syllabus, perhaps one of the first introductions your students have to you, you really dismiss what many of us, when we come into this profession, the hierarchical positioning of us as the expert and our students as the receiver of our knowledge. And you really position that very differently and set up an expectation for a co-created space. You acknowledge that you're going to learn as much as they're going to learn.
Right. Yeah. And I think, and again, to the extent that the courses that I teach enable that to, be something that I can foreground, maybe more than courses that other people teach. But I think always in the like learning from them about what kind of interactions in that space work for them, regardless of whatever the content is that we're teaching. And I think one of the reasons why the Zoom stuff is difficult is because even though I'm asking those questions, I don't get a lot of response to that, and so, but yeah, so it goes back to the diversity consultants, what they said, asking, how is this space working for you or isn't working for you, and what can we do to fix it?
I actually have a follow-up question about that. Thank you so much, Julie. It was like everything you said and shared, it was so powerful and so inspiring. So I want to first thank you for that. And one thing that I always have been like working on in my teaching has been the idea of creating that collaborative, inclusive, safe space for the students. And I guess when we think about it, we know what we need to do and we know how we envision that space to look like.
Yeah.
But in practice, we also know that, it's not that easy. So I've been doing throughout the semester, instead of waiting until doing student evaluations, maybe mid-semester and the end of the semester, I've been doing those, like asking them what's working, what's not working, how can we like improve the course, what we can do, approach. And I've been doing that. But for the most part, when you establish like respect and kindness is really important, and a majority of the students really respond to it that way, especially when you are responding to them in that way throughout the semester. But sometimes, there have been some cases, maybe some students, like the line kind of gets blurry for them, that they cross over being like, how do I say it? Like when you want them to be honest, but they cross over to a side of that things get a little disrespectful in their word choices and expressions, like how they communicate their concerns to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What do you do when that happens? Like, and how do you communicate that to the students? Because I usually send out like surveys a couple times and they're anonymous because I want them to feel comfortable. So there's no way I can directly address it to the student. But I've been trying to find ways to communicate that in a way that I don't come across as defensive, as you put it.
Yeah. So, and so what is it that I'm trying to figure, so in their response to your survey, they were disrespectful toward you? Is that what happened?
Yeah, like I can give an example. There was just one comment like about like the class structure is quote unquote stupid and it shouldn't be working that way. And that was it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It shouldn't it shouldn't be done that way. It should be done in a completely different way without giving any but how.
Right.
I
Okay.
could have probably moved beyond that if there was like a suggestion, but none. So
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've gotten that comment before too. This isn't what you're supposed to be teaching in this class. I'm like, oh, do tell, but and so that gets back to kind of what Diane was saying earlier. So this balance between I have expertise that you need to learn from, like you can't do what I'm doing, you know? And we're co-constructors of this space, right? So kind of walking that line, it kind of sounds like that's what you're kind of talking about. And it is true, when I make myself more vulnerable to my students, I'm making myself more vulnerable to my students, right? Like more vulnerable to that kind of commentary, which is why it's, you know, it's an intentional, it needs to be for each, you know, faculty member, a choice about what kind of, how they want to construct that. But what I've done with that comment in the past is, when I report back to the students from what they're you know, the sort of the supplemental evaluation, when I do my report back, I talk about, you know, the suggestions that were, you know, there were sort of patterns of suggestions, right? Or patterns of commentary. And then, you know, my proposed ways of addressing those concerns, right? And then having a conversation about that. And then I explain, you know, so I also, you know, had some patterns of commentary about this other thing, which I'm not going to change for these reasons, right? So like, this is, let me try to do a better job of making transparent to you why things are set up the way they're set up, like why I'm doing it this way, right? And so I don't know that that will solve the problem of a student being, you know, disrespectful, but at least for me, it creates a space to say, you know, hey, like, I know what I'm doing, you know, and it would be, you know, you could learn something from me if you let yourself. So I don't know, maybe other people have other ideas of how they've responded to what I'm sure is a comment they've received as well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Julie, as you just talked about the last part there about, hey, I do know what I'm doing. And it caused me to think about, you know, you really express very humbly in the beginning in your syllabus statement about respecting all voices and recentering voices, et cetera. But then your last statement, you know, I kind of thought about, I wonder, even though you identify as holding many standpoints of privilege, you're still a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that maybe as a woman, you have to emphasize and reaffirm that differently than maybe what a person who's a male in a course, in terms of, I do know what I'm talking about. Do you feel
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. That you know, has become less of an issue as I got older. And one thing that I used to do when I first came to ISU in 1999 was and I did this for many years. On the first day of class, I passed around my Vita, and I said, you know, I want you to know what you're paying for, you know, like this is, and they're like, wow, you know, you have a book? And I'm like, yeah, I do. And like, I wanted this big award, you know, I'm like, I'm a person in the field, you know, and that kind of, you know, was a rhetorical strategy to you know, create that, help them understand that, you know, I have expertise, I have authority, and you need to respect it. And I also think, you know, one of the other things that, you know, the statement that I read on the syllabus is not something I would have put on my syllabus, you know, 20 years ago. And one of the reasons was, I had real sort of ambivalence about being, you know, their mother, you know, like the sort of like, I'm not your mom, like, yeah, I'm, you know, and so what are the issues of like the expectations put on female teachers around, you know, care? Like, so there's an article, I forget the author's name, but it's, you know, how many of them can you hold to your breast? You know, it's just like, you know, you're never in your office. And it's like, you mean I'm not in my office when you show up, but, you know, I'm there all the time, right? And those sorts of things. And I kind of got to a place where I decided, you know, and I still have ambivalence about around that and the gendered expectations for a certain kind of care um, that are, you know, real. And I kind of got to a place myself where I was just like, this is who I want to be in the world. Like, you know, if a student is having, you know, a crisis and needs someone to walk them over to the student counseling center, like I'm going to be the person that does that. Like this is what I want to do. Um, but yeah, so I do think students questioning my authority, you know, has definitely happened over the years. And um, I remember saying to one colleague once, this is not that long ago, you know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, at the end of a class that I taught and the students' presentations, a really smart, you know, white male student gave a talk, and then I asked him a question that met the, you know, level of the complexity of his talk. And he was like, wow, you know, that was a good question. And I told my colleague later, I'm like, that guy finally figured out I'm at least as smart as he is, you know? And, and he was like, wow, that was a really good question. But anyway, so yeah.
That's fun. Hey, Julie, on an entirely different point, I really appreciated some of your opening remarks when you talk about inclusivity is not additive. It's not just adding a couple of things to your syllabus and bam, now I'm inclusive. You know, I really so appreciated that. And then the examples that you gave really demonstrated for us how it really becomes infused throughout. You talk about the different levels of scale and how you really bring it and manifest it. And it's not just a few things on a syllabus, a few readings on a syllabus, you know, really, really appreciate that. And then even, you know, so I think you're a model for us, you're a beacon, you're an inspiration for us on that. But I also think back about speaker we had on campus, the very first CRCC we had, in Rich Milner, would often say, start where you're at, but don't stay there, you know. And so I do know there are conversations on campus of different faculty looking at their curriculum,
Yeah.
And starting with the place of, let's look at what our readings are and our, you know, experiences that we show to students, and at least make sure we have some diversity in their readings. Now, you know, that's a first step. It's a place to start. But I really hold out what you're putting out is that's not just good enough. Start there if you need to, but that's not just good enough.
Yeah, yeah, and I think so. Like in our English department, when we had a vote recently on language for our ASPT guidelines, the wording was, you know, working toward this. We're working toward this, and with an understanding that, you know, it's not just this one thing you start, but you work toward it. And that was one of the things that I forgot to put on my PowerPoint, which was, you know, thinking about inclusivity and accessibility in this way, I think works to helping us realize diversity, with diversity understood as, and this is a definition that I heard from Dr. Merton Runningwolf, who's a professor at University of Nevada, Reno. Several years ago, I was at a workshop there, and he defined diversity as a meaningful interaction with difference, which I love that definition because it emphasizes interaction.
It's dynamic.
Yeah, yeah. And so I agree with you. I mean, I think, and this goes back to what Doris was saying too, about the importance of people not feeling judged, you know, and how, and in our department meetings when we talk, I remember Doriel Harris saying, you know, in doing this work, we're going to fail, you know, we're going to fail, and that needs to be okay, right? And so in addition to starting where we're at and moving forward from there, also recognizing that we're going to screw up, and that's a part of doing the work, and we can't use that as a reason to not try. But it makes it harder to try when you feel like you're judged when you try and you fail, you know?
You know, I think something that was quite helpful for me, and I just share this out and then I want to get other people's thoughts. Something that was quite helpful for me is when the term cultural competency began to be interrogated. That was really relieving for me because when I think about competency, I think about competence and being done and having arrived and having achieved an ultimate. And I felt so inadequate to that. And then when I began to hear the a much better term of cultural humility, it's like, oh, I can do that, you know. So it was really a door opening for me to have the courage to be vulnerable and keep working on it. You know?
Definitely.
I'm just curious, Julie, if I can ask the question. Some of others of you came today. You came to this, so it must be something that piques your interest in terms of bringing inclusivity more and more into the classroom. And I'd be curious, like, how have you begun to maybe put a toe in the water, or even maybe make some strides on this? What have you used in your classrooms?
So just a comment. I was going to actually make the same issue about potential conflicts earlier, but you know, my more of a comment was, you know, I think that phrase in your syllabus is wonderful, and you mentioned about maybe not, it's not applicable maybe to all situations, but I think it is to some extent. It's just we can go more or less towards it, right? So, you know, even if we're teaching, let's say, science classes where there will be, you know, a lot of direct learning, you know, if having just creative opportunities within that, where students are going out doing their own work, and they're coming back with their findings, you know, giving us as instructors the opportunities to learn as well from them, and showing an openness to that. And, you know, we don't know the right answers to this. This is still, you know, an unknown. What you bring to me is really, really valuable. So, you know, I would say, no, this is relevant to other classes as well. And I think including, you know, occasional, you know, we may not be able to do it all the time, but occasionally these creative exercises that students can put in their own work towards. And then, as you said, peer review. You know, I think peer review is a wonderful thing to get the students engaged and talking to one another, and feeling included in a classroom environment.
Thanks, Ben. What about other folks?
I mean, I've been working, just being a new faculty here this semester, and not having to meet the students face to face kind of brought like a different kind of challenge, I guess. Because I'm new, like majority of them don't know me, and usually like the kind of introductions that I do in the class and the first couple of weeks is really devoted to building a relationship that actually contributes to like start creating that you know, space of collaboration. Because one thing that I try to do in my teaching is really centralize students and make sure that they start gaining the confidence and also start using the tools to shape their own learning experience. I don't want them to rely, of course, I want them to rely on me to provide them the guidance and the direction and the support, but I don't want them to rely on me to tell them what they should be learning and how they should be learning. So that's one thing that I try to establish and tell them that this is something that you need to share with me because I can be responsive to how you want to work with different texts. So that has been like a little challenging this semester, of course, with Zoom and asynchronous teaching structure that I implemented to my course design. They do weekly video responses, and sometimes, you know, when things get a little overwhelming, they want me to maybe spend a little bit more time explaining what the readings are and which parts that they need to focus on. And that's something that actually Julie thankfully gave me some advice on how to approach that with the students a couple of weeks ago, to let why it is important for them to spend time with the readings, and explaining that was really helpful. And I think it also gave them more confidence that, you know, that they have the skills and the capabilities to engage with the readings and provide, reflect on them by making their own arguments. So there's no right or wrong argument or no right or wrong way to engage with the readings. And sometimes that's something that might be a little challenging when they enter like a class focusing on rhetoric and writing and argumentation. So that's what I've been mainly focusing on, having that conversation with the students. But I also want to ask a brief question to Julie again, because I really like the idea of including students in the process of, selecting the texts for the course. I'm just curious, like, at which stage of course planning that would be part of the process? If
That's a good question. That was the question I had for the student consultants too. I was just like, well, I've got to write my syllabus over the summer and I don't know who you are. I'm just like, well, we're talking about like, the second part of the semester, right? And so, and this is hard if you're like me, when you want your 16 weeks laid out, like before they ever enter the room. I remember this just came into my head, one of my teaching mentors years ago saying, I came up with the perfect syllabus and all the wrong students showed up. So it's like, so the student consultants who made that suggestion weren't saying it has to be, for the entire course, right? But like at least have part of the course, one unit, or where students have options of text, or select the text that the class focuses on, and which then requires that you build in to the syllabus this kind of flexibility that happens later.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. That gives me an idea for the spring at least. Thank you.
Julie, can you see the chat yet, or shall I read something to you?
Yeah.
Ben had to run to another commitment, and he wondered if you would be willing to share the text that you put up on the share screen with what you planned.
I'm happy to share it, and it was actually longer. That was just an excerpt of it. It had a thing in there about, this was a suggestion, I can't remember who gave this to me, but it was create a ReggieNet forum, have one of the topics be kind of a like, hey everyone, could you not say the term X that's ableist, kind of like just, hey people, let's, I prefer if, we not do this. So that's in there. And then also a statement about respecting people's pronouns and preferred names. And so it was kind of a long statement. But yeah, I'm happy to share the whole thing.
Thank you. If you share it, Julie, and I think, if you can share maybe the slide or something like that, we can put it up, because we host the meeting, the recording up on our website. We could try to put it up there.
Okay, so send it to Denise?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, that would be good.
Yeah.
Could I call in something, Etta, that you just said? I want to highlight something you just said. We're having our discussion about how to build more inclusive classrooms and promote inclusivity, but you just brought out another benefit when we do that. That might be our purpose, but you also said this also shapes an expectation for our students to be self-directed in their learning, to use critical skills in their learning, and move them past this maybe preconceived ideas of this passive expectation for education. I will just show up and you'll fill my head with stuff and I'll leave with stuff, So not just creating inclusive environments, boy, but what a beautiful byproduct, as our lights go out, beautiful byproduct of really instilling them to be self-directed in their adult education.
Yeah, no, that's something that I always try to centralize in my teaching, that learn from like great mentors and colleagues, and continue to learn how to do that as of like today, just joining this conversation as a testament to that. And it can be challenging sometimes with certain group of students. It works great, that idea, but sometimes you get a group of students that can be resistant to that idea because of, again, past experiences. So a lot of the time it's also working with the students about why we're doing this and why it is important and how it will benefit them. And one thing that I learned is just like when you're honest with them, like when you're having this conversation, just being honest with them about the why, then they start being honest with you about also what's working for them and what's not working for them. It goes back to Julie's suggestion to like constantly work, like, you know, incorporating their responses to the process. So
yeah, one thing that I started doing recently is the sort of less formal evaluation, supplemental evaluation, and in small groups, you know, I ask them in small groups to what's, you know, what could we tweak here to make your experience better, and then I say, you know, and then you can present it, you know, from the group as a, you know, so it's like 5 minutes at the end of class, you know, and it could be just like a little thing like you know, we want to start not with you talking but with us in small groups or something like that, you know. And so that is helpful because they don't feel like it's just individual, right? Like it's a report back from the group.
yeah, no, that's a great idea. Yeah, thank you.
But and the other thing that too is I teach so many English ed majors, so teacher ed majors, and they tell me that that the making visible the sort of dynamics of the teaching, right? Like the meta work of teaching has been helpful to them too. That the why behind them doing what I'm doing.
So the learning in those
and
classes.
I will say sometimes.
Go
Yeah,
ahead, Julie.
I will say sometimes to my students, you know, I have a reason for everything I do. I don't have time to explain it all to you, you know, and I'm not going to take class time to explain it all to you. But if you want to know the reason behind why I'm asking you to do this, I'm happy to explain it to you. But
Other examples people might have. Julie, I'll share an example, maybe while other people are maybe formulating thoughts. And back in my teaching days a few years ago, I was in the School of Social Work, and you know, we started some discussions on this quite a few years ago, and I'll tell you how we were inspired and what the catalyst was a student in a human development class with all the seminal theorists are of course dead white men. And you have to teach the seminal developmental theories, you know. And a student pushed back and said, this was a BIPOC student, and she said, I drowned in a sea of whiteness in this class, you know. And we were convicted, you know, and that was true. So we certainly looked at, yes, we had to teach the seminal theorists, the ground forming theorists, but there is a ton of literature out there that then critiques those seminal theorists from many different angles to incorporate that in. And then we looked a little further and we realized what else do we bring into the classroom space? You know, do we use videos? Do we use guest speakers? Our assignments, you know, in our discipline, we might use case studies, you know, and what types of case studies do we either develop or draw from that show whole different diversities of lived experience, you know. So it was even beyond just the reading. It was so that so that students could see themselves and the lives that they come from in many different aspects of the curriculum. So it was eye-opening. It was humbling.
yeah. Yeah, that's something that I'm really glad the inclusion of, so a lot of times if I assign a book, or an article, I'll find online an interview with that person and show the video of the interview. So it's like, this is, and I always tell them when I was in school, I thought everybody I was reading was, you know, dead. You know, I didn't know that like this was somebody I could actually meet at a conference. You know, this is like a person, living, breathing person in the world today. And so including different kinds of media, right? Yeah, it's an important inclusivity.
Other comments from folks?
I guess I'll make a comment. I teach a lot of literary history, and so in terms of the, you know, inviting students to help choose the texts, you know, I've thought about that over the years. Oftentimes the students who come into my classes have very little background, for example, in the African-American literature courses that I teach. And so what I found the last time that I taught, rather than inviting that kind of participation, I opened up the usual assignments. You know, generally, you know, I'll assign analytical essays and exams, but I invited students to tell me how they wanted to show, you know, demonstrate the knowledge that they'd gained in the class, and promised that I would be completely open-minded about what they came up with. And I was actually blown away by some of the different responses, you know, from English education students. You know, I had different lesson plans. I had students responding in letters that I thought were very powerful. I've had video responses. And so that really worked well. And what I found, it really challenged my own sense of you know, what is a proper assignment in a literary history class, because what the students showed me was that there are so many ways to demonstrate the expertise that they'd gained in the course of our class.
A lot of diversity.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was thinking too, Chris, with the literary history, with students selecting text. So one thing that I do in my rhetorical theory class is, you know, because I'm teaching the rhetorical theory, one thing I do is one student for each class period at the first 5 minutes shares an artifact, right? Like this is an artifact of rhetoric in the world that they found interesting. And I wonder, like in the literary history class, if like an artifact of something where that history is in conversation with the present.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think you bring in an aspect of relevancy for the students with that type of question.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if Tony was going to say something. I don't want to put you on the spot, Tony, but were you about to say something earlier?
I wasn't. You just put me on the spot.
I am so sorry. I was trying to read. I thought your nonverbals, you were looking to unmute.
I did too. I thought that
You
too.
were just killing a bug on your desk.
Quite a bit. You know, some of us were in the additive stage, I think. You know, back in the day, adding, you know, sections on gender in the French Revolution class, or focusing more on the Haitian Revolution was a big deal for us in my field. I felt a little better when you mentioned some of the things about inclusivity in terms of pedagogy, right? Asking students to help structure the syllabus, selecting readings, variation kinds of assignments. Those things I think some of us do intuitively, but it focuses less on diversity. So to me, some of these things are moving along separate tracks. One is, you know, how I treat my classes and approach them pedagogically, and the other track is kind of diversity and having more authors and focusing on women and gender, the Haitian Revolution. But I don't know if I've meshed them very well yet, and I'm just kind of wrapping my head around ways to do that. And some of your language and your syllabus point some direction. I'll look forward to more suggestions.
So Tony, you call out, you know, we're kind of on we're on parallel tracks here. I mean, in some ways it might be the actual content of our curriculum, and in other ways it's very much the pedagogy and our method of interacting and being in the classroom. I want to call out, Julie, how much I appreciate too you saying that inclusivity includes inviting your students in and believing in your students and suggesting maybe you should consider this for publication or presentation at a conference, and really in a way, you know, transferring confidence to them and how important that is for our students, especially here at ISU where we believe in individualized attention. I won't bore you with a personal story, but it regards Dr. Mildred Pratt and the very fact that I'm sitting here. And it was because of that kind of an experience.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think and building confidence, but also like it, what you have to say matters, and this space is better because you are here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that gets back to what you were saying, Etta, that invites them into really being self-directed in their learning because they feel recognized and seen, you know.
Yeah, and I think that makes a huge impact on how they approach the class, and especially like currently I'm also working with mainly English ed students, and it's like amazing for me to see that they also start thinking like reflecting on who they are as educators and the kind of educators they want to be, and I'm just really happy to see that the class also started to have that kind of an impact on them. So
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Oops.
I am interested in, you know, the thing that multiple people have been talking about now, which is the, you know, multiple times a semester kind of like surveys or check-ins. And I think, and I mentioned as people were filing in for this, that, you know, this semester I'm not teaching a class, but I work with interns and graduate assistants. So, you know, my interactions with them are all, you know, one-on-one. So it's very easy for me to take kind of like informal, you know, informally gather feedback about how things are going, you know, the kinds of things that they're learning, but also how they're managing everything that's happening in the world and the technology that they're dealing with. But I'm wondering in a classroom setting then, like that's a long preamble. What are those mid-semester, multiple semester, one, how are you gathering that? Is it, I know that you'd mentioned that some of them are anonymous, which I think is valuable, but, you know, is this like a specific, like online survey, you know, so sort of like, how is it distributed? But then like, what are the actual things that you're asking about?
Yeah. So the times that I do it, it's really pretty general, like what's working for you. So I keep doing it, you know, that's important. What's working, what's not, and what are your suggestions for revision? It's sort of the same questions I have them ask each other on their writing, you know, so it's like everything is always in a rough draft, you know, this class is in a rough draft and we can revise it. And so what's working for you, what isn't, what are your suggestions for revision? And I haven't mastered the online survey yet. That's a literacy that I look forward to gaining in the future. You know, in the face-to-face class, I pass out a handout, you know, a piece of paper that has that on it, you know, those 3 prompts. And then other times it's just a quick check-in. I give out little index cards. And again, this is the face-to-face, but little index cards different times throughout the semester, and they can just write on there, you know, any kind of feedback on how the class is working for them. And sometimes they'll say things like, you know, smiley face, or, you know, but other times it'll be like, you know, we need longer time in our small groups, like you interrupt us too soon, some like stuff like that. And then the small groups where they report back verbally are the 3 main ways that I've done it.
Awesome, thank you.
I'm sorry, one time I had them, so this wasn't anonymous, but they emailed them to me, and then I took all of everything, and with their permission, I cut and paste all of the what's workings together, what isn't working together, and what are your suggestions for revision together, so they could just read everybody's, you know, right. And what was so interesting is you see under what's not working showing up under what's working, right? Like the same thing. And so, you know, I say to them, this is why I vary it, right? This is why sometimes we do it this way and sometimes we don't, because it works for some people, but not others.
That's why diversity works, right?
Yeah.
Diversity in learning styles.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to be respectful of folks' time because we typically schedule these for an hour. I can certainly hang on in the Zoom space if anybody needs to or wants to. So shall we all just be very grateful for what Julie shared today, right? I also want to put a plug in that the CRCC, the Culturally Responsive Campus Community Conference, is coming up the end of this month, October 29th and 30th. I hope we haven't passed the registration date. I don't think we have. It's just a fantastic opportunity. So it might be another place to get some ideas. I'm going to go back to what Rich Milner told us a few years ago. No shame in your game. If you're looking at this as an issue and earnestly trying to figure how I can do better,